this conference, I call it the Conference of Polluters, given the track record of Copenhagen. There was a disaster, it fell apart. Last year, I'll come to last year in Cancun. This isn't the last chance. Certainly the Rio +20 attempt to assess where, after 2 decades from the first Big Earth Summit in Rio, some of the conventions stand, and maybe they can be put together and a new World Environmental Organization be established. But really, to do it properly, let's make sure that the Rio +10 doesn't happen. Why? That was Johannesburg. These are about 30,000 South African activists and their international allies. A very high proportion of Canadians. I can see in that crowd Naomi Klein, Avi Lewis, Tony Clark, Maud Barlow. All of your people were really helpful in contesting the UN and the privatization of water and the Global Compact and the privatization of the air. Privatization of the air? I think you just saw a little film about cap and trade, carbon trading, the sale of the right to pollute. This was 30,000 people, and in fact the year before in Durban at the World Conference Against Racism, about 15,000 people saying that what's going on in the UN isn't very good. It's too much corporate power and control and too much commodification. And what was the WSSD commentary on the climate? What did they have to say? Absolutely correct. They didn't say anything. They just left the climate off entirely. In spite of all this protest and attempt to put climate and to put social justice, really the WSSD failed. We're very, very happy that High Commissioner Pecco, who probably is one of these people here in the WSSD. And so that failure reflected, I think, something general about mineral-rich economies. This one doesn't look too good either in terms of the awareness of the society to put pressure on elites to do something about greenhouse gas emissions. So South Africa looks pretty bad. This is the latest data I've got, 2006, but I don't think it's changed so much. But we have to change that by November. US, Canada, Nigeria, China, so not good company for changing the climate. Particularly because the modus operandi by the previous South African government was often quite, some say crony capitalist or neoliberal or too close to big business, to a relationship in which anyone could sneak in and use any sort of wording to get what they wanted under rubrics like type 2 partnerships, public-private partnerships, and other euphemisms for privatization. And so we have this greatest cartoonist in the world, I think, in Cape Town, called Zapiro. So I think if I take that sentiment that too much corporate power has affected the way the climate debates emerged, you'll see, especially for the looting of Africa, the book I wrote, documents, there's a lot. In fact, this is an UNCTAD document. A lot of this comes through a certain fraction of capital extractive industries. So the minerals, the oil, some of the cash crop plantation-based corporates are really making out from 2002, continuing on because of a huge boom in the price of minerals and cash crops and oil. So here's the terms of trade of Africa. So the ability to export cash crops, minerals, and especially oil really is taking off. This is from the World Bank. This is from the IMF. You see the reason is because of this unprecedented recent commodity boom, some of it exceptionally speculative. I mean, oil was up to $148 or $45, I think it was, a barrel by mid-July, by mid-2008, before crashing back, along with some of the other metals and minerals and food crops and all, were just out of control. And some of them have rebounded to the point where we can also, again, talk about speculative influences in pricing rather than real underlying demand. The impact of that crash, desperately disastrous for many African countries. Some, of course, with the oil bouncing back, have been doing well. Equatorial Guinea is the fastest growing country in the continent. It's actually one of the worst run, so if you're being told that good governance plus free markets equal growth, well, there's some overriding factors. The world commodity price cycles, Angola, Chad, Sudan, Nigeria, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon being other major oil exporters. But once we start looking at whether that increase in GDP, that growth, is real, we have to actually start correcting, because we know that the GDP doesn't properly measure what's really happening in Equatorial Guinea, where extractive processes mean that non-renewable resources are pulled out and not renewed for future generations. So what is counted as a credit on the GDP, what's counted by economists as a good thing. In fact, if we were to properly measure, we'd have to say, well, there's a debit going on, it's just a credit. The debit is from the natural capital, the assets of the country. And when you make those kinds of corrections, and you correct in pollution, and you correct in unpaid labor of women, you correct in the community, you correct in all these different processes of really defining progress. A group in San Francisco, redefining progress, is just one example. Well, it doesn't look quite so good. The world GDP is really flattened out and stagnant, and many huge environmental problems are still to hit. So one institution that I normally don't cite approvingly, the World Bank, has done something quite interesting I want to draw your attention to, which is to try to figure out, of that extraction, the contribution to a resource curse, how can we kind of understand the cost genuinely of extraction if we consider different types of tangible wealth. So you've got, in the case of Ghana, if we go to the top, your subsoil assets. Every Ghanaian in the year 2000, so this is a sort of snapshot year, that the book, Where is the Wealth of Nations, is on the website, 2006. So this book says in Ghana, in 2000, the average Ghanaian had $65 worth of subsoil, of mineral wealth, and now there's oil since then. And they had $290 worth of timber. That's their sort of natural capital, plus some non-timber forest resources, some protected areas of cropland, pasture land. So that's a fair amount of natural capital up here. And then there's produced sort of capital of machines and the built environment, the roads and the infrastructure. And then every year, a Ghanaian will save $40 on average, and they'll spend $7. Now, when they save, that's good. You know, they've got more money for future investments. This you could consider education spending, but it's really investment in human capital. And then some of the fixed capital machines will be worn out, so wear and tear will reduce by $19. They didn't have that oil yet, so they hadn't depleted their energy. Mineral depletion, $4 per person, and forests, they've taken $8 worth of forest resources. The bottom line is that when you adjust the savings, it isn't 40, it's down to 16. And then there's population growth. They grew 2%. So the wealth per person in Ghana, when you make all these corrections, shrunk by $18 because of the extractive process as much as anything. And when you look at sort of taking that fixed capital, depreciating it, but then you add for education. And then this is this crucial point I'm trying to drive at. Now you deplete your natural resource. You don't have these renewable resources, non-renewable resources again. And then you've got pollution. Now we're really talking about a better measure of what's been happening in an African economy. And this is indeed for the world. And if you do that for all the countries in that year 2000, you find that the poor Gabonese, who had, it seemed, a $3,370 per person GDP, not distributed very well at all, of course, another dictatorship and a small clique. But on average, that $3,370 per person shrinks by some $5,000. It's negative $2,241 when you make the corrections that we just went through. So the average Gabonese is shrinking their natural capital, their entire wealth, their wealth per capita, their savings and all by a lot every year, 2,241. The Nigerians, with all the oil being extracted or not, the Niger Delta activists will come back to, are keeping the oil in the soil. They're losing 210. Even in South Africa, our most advanced industrial country, still a lot of minerals being extracted and a minus $2 per person per year in the year 2000. Well, how we should have just stayed in bed that year and not got up, and we wouldn't have lost the $2. That's the point. I mean, that we're actually losing. There's a genuine losing process that non-renewable resource extraction is part and parcel of. It's also creating a dependency. So I mentioned some of those oil countries, a whole lot of others as well, like Zambia on copper is famous, but Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Congo, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, mainly oil countries. 90% plus of their exports are these primary commodities. And then another aspect of this resource curse and dependence is when the dictators who've come to power in these places. Okay, Abacha in Nigeria, we had the apartheid regime in South Africa, Hassan, Morocco, Mobutu in the DRC, Ben Ali in Tunisia, can be crossed off that list, Nimeri, Mengistu Moy, Sassou, Traoré, Siad Barre, Banda, Idema, Samuel Birmania, Idi Amin, Bokassa. So this long list, I'm sure you have your other favorites to add from different countries today. And that's a lot of debt that was taken on by these dictators to repress people to stay in power. And that's an odious debt as part and parcel usually of keeping the resources in the hands of, in many of these cases, just a small clique. But wait a minute, didn't Canada help cancel a lot of debt? Do you remember it was a Gleneagles G8, Kananaskis 2002, but Gleneagles, they really got around with the G8, the G7 finance ministers just before, and they canceled all that unpayable debt, right? Well, yes and no. So there was a lot of debt to cancel, to be sure. But the crucial question is what's being repaid each year. It's not really the stock, but it's the flow of debt. And that doesn't look so good. This is an IMF report, and it shows for the last few years pretty flat annual repayment of debt in relation to exports. So the burden of the foreign debt actually has been the same or rising, and indeed exports have risen. So it's actually not very impressive to think that after 2005 there was great debt relief, because poor countries are still being squeezed and milked as much as they can be. It's not really impressive as a result to write off debt that couldn't be repaid anyway. It's, you know, African countries still being pushed and pulled to repay that old odious debt. And if that resource curse also implies a small clique getting most of the benefits, they don't want to keep it in the country, do they? They'll move it away. And again, most recent data, I think that's been developed about capital flight from the continent. Leonce Ndikumana, who's based at the African Development Bank, James Boyce at UMass, they've developed studies of capital flight from African countries, and again, major resource curse countries like Angola and Nigeria at the top of the list of the capital flight in relation to the stock of debt. So that's a big problem, because aside from one little place called Santa, Africa's hot money center, it's not really staying around. It's basically going up to the old colonial powers or offshore financial centers. So that's a little background, and now we have to say, well, can't the world sort this out? And so now I have a little riff to permit about why I'm a little pessimistic that the next G8 meeting, I know Toronto wasn't so easy last year, and I know everyone's hoped that lots of major summits, the G20 is now the expanded terrain, and now we also have a new power relationship with South Africa joining the BRICS countries, and we've got lots of possibilities. But let's be frank, the context not only of the African economies being looted, but the world not really doing anything is pretty miserable. The last time I think we had a good global arrangement, but correct me if I'm wrong, in Canada I'm always ruffling feathers by suggesting global governance isn't working. I know this is like an act of faith to have Canadians say, no, we must solve these problems at the global scale. But Montreal, was that the last time that there was a global problem of such magnitude that the world elite said, oh, we got to sort this out, let's ban fluorocarbons so that we don't have a growing ozone hole. I'm not sure, is there anybody that would throw out a subsequent global scale reform that really dealt with the problem at that scale? Look at all the reasons why, and I think, you know, help me if I'm wrong, I think neoliberals took control of many of these multilateral institutions, if they hadn't already been neoliberal, in the 90s, and then neoconservatives, especially in the UN, and where the US had influence, maybe from Ottawa, that was a sort of dominant. I think in the current epoch with Obama, it's probably a fusion of the two. I mean, you think of personalities, I'll come back to one running the World Bank, Robert Zoellick, neo-lib, neo-con, sort of in some harmony we didn't think possible, but there is. Can these institutions be reformed? World Bank, IMF, certainly again South Africa has been at the cutting edge of saying there needs to be more voice. And there was a little shift in voting power at the last G20 that was in Korea last November, so there was a 6% change, but Africa's influence actually has been falling. That may change if Dominique Strauss-Kahn, IMF managing director, runs for French president, as is expected, and